Perfect. Okay, so let's go to the next slide real quick, just to have, again, the link to the collaborative notes if anyone missed that. Also in your chat, so you should have that, but please do raise your hand if you need that. Florio is monitoring our chat and he can always answer with any questions. All right, let's go to the next slide. Just quick introductions of who we have here as our current co-chairs of the Cure Fair work group. I'll just introduce myself real quick. I'm Lee Moore-Peer. I'm at the Institution for Social and Policy Studies at Yale University. I'm Associate Director for Research, and I manage our data archive, and I've been working on issues related to reproducibility and curating for reproducibility for a long time at this point. We have Florio Arguelles from the Cornell Institute for Social and Economic Research at Cornell University, and Florio is a research associate and also has created a service at Cornell for what they're calling R2 for result reproduction service, and is also one of the founding members, along with myself and Tumai Christian, of the Cure Consortium. So next is Tumai Christian, who is Assistant Director for Archives at the Odum Institute at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And Tumai has also been very active in this space, oversees the analysis verification and reproducibility verification process that Odum is doing for the American Journal for Political Science and others, and it has a lot of experience in that. And then we are also, our fourth co-chair is Anthony Juni. Am I pronouncing correctly, Anthony? Yes.
That's perfect.
Good, okay. Who is at RDA US and has the expertise, the most relevant expertise right now, right, with epidemiology, biostatistics, and kind of has also been leading a lot of initiatives within RDA around health and health data, but also is taking leadership roles within RDA and RDA US in particular. So that is our group, and we're going to be kind of going through some of our presentations of the current working groups and how we came together and what we hope to do today. So yes, thank you. So that was a little bit about who we are and why we're here. We're here because we are hoping to create a space within RDA to work on issues related to curation for reproducibility and for FAIR in particular. So we're going to go a little bit more in depth into what we mean by all of this, but I think kind of the big picture or the rationale for why we think this is important is outlined here, which is that in scientific research today, in scholarly research, most, I don't know if most, but a lot of analysis, a lot of results, a lot of scientific claims are generated through computation or captured in computation. And so we think that that component adds a lot of opportunity in terms of curation, but also adds a layer or a level of challenge to curation that that hasn't really been addressed directly. And we think that there's great work to be done here. So what we're hoping to do is deal with computational reproducibility, which is the ability to repeat the analysis and arrive at the same results. And how do you curate for that? How do you, what are the actions, the practices, and the guidelines necessary for enabling computational reproducibility and curating the materials that consist of the package that will eventually be reproduced. So our approach to curation takes this into account as a process. In other words, we're not thinking of curation as curating necessarily discrete objects, but as a package of objects that are going together, that have a relationship, and that support computational reproducibility, whether they're data, their code, their documentation, and other materials. And so as I said, to do curation across all of these components, we need to curate data, we need to curate code, we need to curate the relationship between them, and include other additional information. So that's sort of the impetus, what prompted us to come together and to propose RDA with this idea of a work group that can really work on this and engage the community and bring together. And we think RDA is such a fantastic venue for this, a great outlet for this, because because for one, it's very action oriented, and we're excited about that, so that we can stay on task and we can produce an outcome, and it's not just sort of people talking. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but we want to we are action oriented, and we want to make progress. But also another great advantage, we think, is the community itself and the diversity of the community on different levels. So we think having a diversity of approaches and expertise and frameworks and domains, is really a plus. So we're very excited about that. So we can go to the next slide, in which we just sort of outline the agenda for today. We're going to go through a little bit of introduction on what we mean by curation, how do we see curation, a little more about reproducibility and FAIR, and after which we're going to delve into a discussion more specifically, from the abstract to the work of the working group, and talk a little bit about the community, how we define the scope of this work. And that's where we're going to really hope to have your participation and input. At the sort of the third half of our time together, we're going to delve a little more deeper into the case statement, which one of the goals one of our goals in proposing this joint session is to get feedback from the community on the case statement, so that we can then take it back, refine it, revise it, and take it back to RDA to formalize and become an official work group. So we'll take you through what we have so far, and look forward to your feedback. And I should say, this feedback is both at the session itself, but also like on an ongoing basis. So obviously we would love to have everyone's participation, and you'll have a chance to indicate whether you want to participate and how much, and we really hope to have a lively and engaged community to work with us on all of this. So my co-hosts, is there anything I left out that you want to jump in and mention at this time? If not, we can move to the next step.
Nope, this all sounds really great, Limor.
Okay, great. So I think that Tumai is taking it from here. We can continue doing it this way, or Tumai, if you prefer, you can share your screen, and then you have control of the slides. It's up to you.
Let's go with this. I don't want to break anything. So Anthony, if you don't mind.
Sounds good. If my internet lags or if there's any problems there, I'll do my best to monitor chat and everything, but take it away to me.
All right, thanks. So at this point, what we want to do is just kind of set the stage and make sure we're all on the same page with what we're talking about when we say curation and also reproducibility, and kind of how this comes together with the FAIR principles that RDA, I think a lot of us who've been participating in RDA have heard quite a bit about. But now we want to put together not only the principles, but also the data curation practices and align those things. So next slide. So as we've already introduced ourselves. It was several years ago at a conference when it occurred to me, I found out that Limor and Florio were both represented organizations that were doing something around computational reproducibility. I knew that Limor had been working on a tool to standardize and streamline the workflow, kind of a curation workflow tool based on specific standards of quality, so the data quality review. Meanwhile, Florio and his group at Sizer, they were doing some work creating the service that Limor had mentioned, going through and working with researchers to make sure that their materials that they have for their articles are reproducible. And so fast forward a few years, in 2016, we formally formed what we call the Cure Consortium, Cure, which stands for Curating for Reproducibility. So going beyond what we see as your standard data curation practices, and really thinking about the entirety of the research process and how the artifacts that come out of that need to be curated and preserved so that we can have that evidence base to demonstrate computational reproducibility. So that was in 2016, and there's the website link there, in progress. I think a lot of people are in that situation, right? Our websites are in progress. And then last fall in Helsinki, we had our first Birds of a Feather to just introduce the work that we were doing and get some feedback, initial feedback from the community about what the primary issues are and what challenges we're facing. And there were more people than we expected. We had over 100 people there. And so I'm so glad to see that people were able to make it today. And I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation around this topic. But basically with this working group, we are focused on the curation practices that support computational reproducibility and FAIR principles. So when we talk about computational reproducibility, we're using that term specifically. As we all know, there are many terms that are associated with reproducibility. But in our case, we're talking about computational reproducibility. Next slide, I think we have our definition. And so for us, we're referring to the changes in scientific practice and reporting standards to accommodate the use of computational technology. Basically, that we're able to use the author's data and code that they used to produce the results in their article, and taking those materials, rerunning it, and getting the same results from that. So same data, same code, and getting the same results. And in our experience, all of us, Florio, Limor, and I, in our work, we found that even though we may have those same materials, they just don't work. So there are issues with documentation, there are issues with the code, there are issues with computational, the computation workstations. So lots of issues happening in the research process that make this a lot more difficult than we ever expected it to be. So that's when we figured we need to do something about this. Next slide. So like I said, consistent results using the same data, computational steps, methods, and code. And this definition came out of the recently published report from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend you go ahead and print yourself out a copy. It has great information on what the funding agencies, at least the US-based ones, are really looking at and how they're defining reproducibility versus replicability and what kinds of initiatives that they would like to see in order to support these two things. Next slide. And to add to the mix, there's another term that we like to introduce, and that's the pre-producibility. So this comes from Stark. He published an article in Nature introducing this term, pre-producible. So basically, an experiment or analysis is pre-producible if it has been described in adequate detail for others to undertake it. And so in order for anything to be reproducible, it needs to be pre-producible. And so this is something that he says makes sense across disciplines. And we know at RDA, especially, we have people from several different disciplines, but this is one of those basic principles, basically, with reproducibility. If you don't have the documentation to even interpret or know what to do, then there's no way you're going to get the same results. Unless you're really lucky, but in my experience, we have not had that kind of luck. And so in terms of reproducibility, what we need is clear, specific, and complete information about any computational methods and data products that support the published results in order to enable other researchers to repeat the analysis. So of course, there are some caveats, non-public data, things like that, but the information should be accessible to some degree to allow researchers to computationally reproduce results that have been reported. Next slide. And so we talk about these principles. We've defined reproducibility, but now we need to figure out, so how do we do it? So that's the thing about a lot of this. Everybody's talking about this, but how do we do it? And an important piece of that is data curation. And in general, digital curation involves maintaining, preserving, and adding value to digital research data throughout its life cycle. So I think there are a few key things in this definition. One is that, we're not just making things pretty, but we really are thinking about the reuse of these materials. And to do that, they need to be maintained, preserved in repository, and we add value, making sure all the pieces that are necessary to perform computational reproduction, that they are there. And then life cycle, I think, is another important aspect. Like Limor mentioned, this isn't just about the objects themselves, it's about a consideration of the entire research data life cycle and what happens and what artifacts are produced during that process. And so when it comes to the FAIR principles, we all know and have been familiar with findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And we're wondering too, and maybe reproducibility is tied to one of these other letters, maybe the reuse, but we wanted to emphasize that a little bit, the reproducibility. So we know there are different kinds of reuse, and we could have lots of conversations about whether or not the principles as they stand include reproducibility. But in our case, we really want to emphasize this. And part of our work is to really thinking about data curation practices and how they map to the FAIR principles, and making sure that reproducibility is one of those things that we see that can be mapped both ways. Next slide. And so in order to do that, we know that we need to bridge the data curation piece with the research piece. And I think that Anthony has a great example of this work that's already been happening with your working group. So I will let you take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you, Sumay. Do let me know if audio gets a little choppy or if there's any difficulties hearing me. And I appreciate all of you making time to participate in this session today, time to engage with us. And thank you so much to co-chairs for collaboration on this project together. It's a very, very exciting, and it's great to see these discussions continuing within RDA. It's always really, really great. So just to provide a bit of background about the Reproducible Health Data Services Working Group. My name is Anthony Juni. My background is in epidemiology and biostatistics. In previous work as clinical and public health, using large-scale hospital EMR to support trials, public health research, and clinical decision support work. In addition, Dr. Leslie McIntosh, who's the executive director of RDA North America, also worked within Washington University, St. Louis. And in addition, we met Oya Bayan at a previous RDA plenary, who works at Aachen University in Germany, using large-scale hospital and governmental data support clinical trial and health research as well. And we all recognize this same issue of the way in which clinical trial data and hospital data and health data is curated and then passed off to a researcher, and the way in which that clinical question is operationalized against that clinical trial data is often left out of that final curated workflow. And all of those documentation principles and documented pieces of code or pieces of data are often left in a silo, essentially a work drawer of someone's desk, and that information is really crucial to the reliability and validity of that final research result. And we were tackling ways in which to actually address this question of how to ensure all of the ways in which data is actually collected, curated, and the ways in which a research question is operationalized against that data, how to make sure that that is transparent and reproducible across different research sites. We worked with John Graybiel and Mark Newson at Stanford University to address ways in which to use a metadata repository to operationalize these concepts, and I'll provide a bit more insight into how that works. Any difficulties hearing me so there? Just making sure. Okay.
Anthony, your audio is a bit choppy.
Okay.
Do you want to turn your video off just for now? Maybe that'll help.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll stop my video. I can't view the chat at the same time, but thank you so much, Stephanie, and please do, anybody, raise your hand essentially, or voice if there's any troubles. So we began kind of the overarching theory of what are the pieces of that curation workflow to ensure it can be both computationally reproducible, meaning the actual materials and data itself can be documented and shareable when ethically justifiable, but then also reach for that level of empirical reproducibility so that if someone wanted to reproduce the way in which this data was collected in a clinical trial or public health and epidemiological trial was ran across different sites, it could be reproducible, reproduced reliably across different populations or different sites. So we looked at ways in which individuals who were familiar with health data brokerage, what their processes looked like, and broke it down into kind of 4 broad categories of how data was requested, the actual processes of curating that data, meaning how is it extracted from a centralized repository, what sort of curation code was necessary, what sort of query codes were necessary, what were the ontologies or metadata standards that were used to operationalize those clinical variables, how is data cleaned or subset, or how were different ontologies crosswalked in order to produce a final clean data set that was passed off to a clinician or a health researcher, and then finally, how are all those materials shared and documented in some sort of reliable way so that they may be linked to a final research publication or something like a IRB or a research, a grant ID. So we then those and dive to see the actual pieces of materials at each points of those of that curation workflow and that data request workflow. So we're looking at things like the actual IRB. We're looking at ways in which that process is revised and resubmitted, any other data curation requirements within there. Then you actually pass this off to a team that's working against that actual extracting the data, structured query scripts, or any sort of Python or similar codes that are necessary to extract data from clinical notes or unstructured data. All of those processes, how do you containerize them? How do you make sure that they're documented in a standardized way and actually reproducible? Then the data cleaning processes of how do you subset data, how do you recode data, all of those codes and shows software, they're necessary to make sure that all of those pieces are reproducible. And then you have the actual final data set and metadata that documents and describes all of those processes. So we had a good understanding in theory of what these workflows look like that were scalable across different and across similar health services sites. But we really wanted to reach towards, okay, we have this in theory, we know what we're looking for in theory, how do we make this actually operationalizable and actually get to the point where we can start documenting it and sharing it and reach for, as Dumaine mentioned, that actual goal of how do we actually do this and make sure that's reproducible. So that's where we reached out to the team at CEDAR, which is the Center for Expanded Data Annotation and Retrieval. I'll have to make sure that that's correct. So the CEDAR team at Stanford, which is John Grable and Mark Musin, were extremely helpful in essentially taking those high-level protocols that describe in a textual fashion the processes for how data is curated and how a clinical trial or epidemiological trial is operationalized across different sites. So you're taking these essentially PDF or document protocols that are non-standardized, testing to see how you can implement them within a software infrastructure and make them more machine readable, and then also link out to external repositories. So essentially you're taking a non-findable. It was completely written in text and in a non-standardized way, so it's not machine readable, and you can't really query against it to find a subset of particular methodologies or particular computational processes. You can't link to the actual code often, and you're not linking to the actual materials that execute those protocols. And it's also some of these protocols and some of these documents are missing sections entirely, so they're not documented in a standardized way. And overall, the entire process for how these epidemiology trials were ran across different sites was was non-fair, it was non-transparent, and overall we could see that was lacking some real issues with reproducibility. I'll highlight some cases here that are coming from a large consortium of efforts known as Odyssey, in which epidemiologists across different research hospitals predominantly within the United States are taking their research hospital EMRs, mapping them onto a common data model, and then attempting to run the codes and software algorithms for operationalizing, extracting cohorts from each of those clinical trial sites, subsetting them into particular treatment pathways, and testing to see if they can operationalize and reproduce the same results and findings across these different sites. Those teams are beginning to kind of ad hoc produce their own ways of trying to aim for reproducibility and aim for quality assessment across these different sites. But this was one major gap that we saw, where their protocols themselves were not machine readable and not standardized. How could we really aim for moving to something like this, where you could document all of your data access procedures and all of those different pieces of the curation workflow within a machine readable and standardized metadata schema that could also be linked to external repositories. So CEDAR allows for interoperability across leading health metadata standards and ontologies. So we thought that this was a really great infrastructure for running this test, to see how we could take this thing that was in theory and documented at a kind of a high level of text, and bring it in and start building a metadata schema that could interoperate with these third-party and external repositories, as well as providing a very streamlined and easy-to-use tool that researchers could go in and use these templates to document their metadata kind of on the fly as they themselves are executing these processes for extracting data, curating data, and preparing data for sharing with a clinician or other people within a team. So with the CEDAR metadata templates and with the CEDAR metadata repository, we were able to make this data findable across different domain-centric metadata repositories. All of those elements within the curation workflow become machine readable and interoperable with those external repositories and metadata standards. You can link in multiple different data types and file types, and the overall aim of this process of documenting these protocols for how these methods are executed across these different sites and documented becomes a bit more standardized, and you build a template to make it easier for people to actually document these things that used to just sit in a desk drawer somewhere. So the end would be something like this. And this is a really great test case that we would hope to, currently we're attempting to see how far we can stretch this and scale it. And we're really always interested in, if anyone else has similar workflows that they'd be interested in using as test cases for these metadata schemas and for this tool and for our working groups efforts. You would have essentially a external GitHub where you can see all the code that's used for building this particular treatment cohort, subsetting and building the final dependent variables of the actual results, building any sort of algorithms and models, as well as the code that's used for operationalizing and executing those analyses methods. So while those might live in an external repository, something like a GitHub or open science platform, you can then link all of those into this standardized metadata repository and the standardized metadata template so that you can more readily export and access all of these protocol and all of these methods within a cleaner and more machine readable and more standardized metadata schema. Again, linkable to a final publication, linkable to a grant ID and a grant document, as well as linkable to these external spaces where the code or data itself might live, given certain restrictions on security. So we've ran some tests here, and we're really trying to see how this practice can scale to either other domains within the social sciences or other aligned domains, or just continuing to run some tests across both within the US and across different sites, given the wonder that is the RDA International platform, trying to see scale this down and the output itself incredibly reusable across different spaces. So that's just an introduction for how to take these things in theory and implement them within some test cases. So that's an overview from my end. And then I think now we'll move into the next phases of the session, where we'll discuss some scope of our working group and have some interaction with you all. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Anthony. I'm wondering if we should pause for a minute now and just see if there are any questions, excuse me, that anyone has about sort of the presentation so far, some of the work that's been done so far. Maybe raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can just drop it in the chat if anyone has any questions or comments at this point. Or you can also put it in the collaborative notes. I think we have people looking into that. Okay, so I'm not seeing very much at the moment. So in that case, I think we'll go ahead and
there's a question.
Ah, okay.
Thank you.
Chat. I'm curious if you can point to how data curation is defined within the workflow.
So just a point, are you referring to data services brokerage workflow?
Yeah, well, the diagram that you had earlier on where you had the 4 steps.
Absolutely. Move to point. That one, break it down a bit more. The data curation is one of the struggles of this is both the excitement and some struggles of terminology that might be used within this particular domain, or making sure that point and clarifying terminology. So I really, this question, it's always fun to see what someone might call curation versus brokerage, etc. So how we're thinking about the process of curation is really taking epistemological or a clinical question that is existing within the field of research that a clinician or a physician or public health specialist might be studying. Again, this can not just to keep in the health domain, but how do you take this research question and operationalize it against the way in which the data exists within a centralized repository or across different siloed repositories? So how do you take those questions, map them onto particular data points or metadata script for particular variables and elements within a repository, or how do you use arrays of ontologies? So for instance, if you're asking a question about a particular disease, how do you say study congestive heart failure? What are the arrays of ICD-9 codes that you might use, ICD-9 or ICD-10 or other clinical ontologies? How do you actually what are the codes that you use analyzing that particular clinical cohort criteria against the available data? How do you put that within software and scripts that run ETLs against that centralized repository? What other algorithms or processes are necessary to extract any other non-textual or unstructured data in order to operationalize that question? And then of adjudication on within that process before you move to that state of cleaning or subsetting. So those processes of data quality checks and potentially recoding or crosswalking across different ontologies, we try to keep those within that data cleaning space. But the curation is really at a broad description. How do you take this question and operationalize it within the ways in which that data is mapped within a particular EMR model or other repository or data model? Does that answer the question?
Yeah, it's just, there's nothing wrong with it. I'm not trying to be a purist about it. It's just a very different way of looking at and using the term. And it's kind of a shame we don't have, curation has come to mean so many different things. And, you know, I look at curation from a perspective of helping somebody get their data appropriate for deposit in a repository. And this is like flipping it around and saying, taking data from a repository almost and making it appropriate for reuse, if I'm understanding it correctly.
That's a perfect way of putting it.
They're both accurate. It's just a way different way of looking at it and thinking about it if you're coming from a repository management perspective. So just an observation. Thanks.
No, that's very helpful. So it could be possible, and in hearing from you, maybe this data curation portion should also exist within the data sharing, the phase of data sharing, in which we're preparing data for, like you were saying, depositing in an external repository or another domain-specific repository. So.
Yeah, maybe just having a scope note or, you know, seeing the diagram conveyed it a lot better for me. So anyway, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That really helped clarify some things. Thank you.
It does. Brian, can I just chime in and ask, if you don't mind, you had a really good way of putting it in terms of like the different ways of thinking about curation. If you don't mind putting that in the notes. When you get a chance, you know, whether it's taking it out of the repository or putting it into the repository. You had a good phrasing for that, so if you don't mind putting that in.
I'll see if I can recreate it. Thanks.
No, thank you for the question and discussion.
Yeah.
Any other points, or we can move on? All right. I'll go ahead and I'm also going to minimize this chat window for a bit. Okay. So I think now we want to have just some interaction with everyone, where we're trying to get some feedback and interaction with you all within an interactive poll. And if any of my fellow co-chairs also want to add anything here. So we create a poll online. Thank you. Let me see if there's. Thank you. It's also in your chat. Trying to think presentation-wise, if I want to pull up this
Anthony,
poll.
why don't you stop stop sharing, and then I'll show the live results as people are putting it in, and then
perfect.
I'll get back to you. Let's do that.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, so I'll let you.
All right. And the link is also, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, I can see you.
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
And this is really a question I was really curious about. The last time at the Plenary 14, we got such a variety of people, and their perspectives are really interesting. Like Brian, you just were a model of how we use these terms differently. So we're really curious about where you're coming from in this space, and then I'd also like to talk about as in your role, how are you supporting reproducibility at this point, or how do you imagine yourself supporting reproducibility? I think that's probably everyone except for the co-host, right?
Yeah, we have 18 participants, and we've got 14 people responding. So I think we're probably close. Yep.
So mostly data support professionals, some researchers, which is great. Sometimes I feel like a lot of the data support professionals, we tend to talk to ourselves. So it's nice to have researchers in the room so that we can connect repository managers. Okay, I'm going to stop the share. So Stephanie, there is an other. Stephanie, can you tell us what your role is?
Okay, I'm actually a member of the RDA Secretariat, so I don't really, I'm just here to support the session really, so that's why I don't quite fit in there. Thanks.
Okay. But you're supporting this community who's working towards these things, so you're part of the conversation as well. Yes, infrastructure provider. I think that's an important one as well.
That's great. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For those of you who are data support professionals, can any of you tell me what you're doing now at your organization?
Maybe I can start. My name is Huajin Wang. I'm from Carnegie Mellon University. So my university is a very tech-heavy institution, and then there's obviously reproducibility is a big issue. I think nobody has a really good solution. What we try to do at the university libraries is try to help people with the best practices and workflow. When they deposit, we get very little involvement when they actually produce the data, but usually they came to us when they try to share the data and deposit the data. That's where we sort of come in. We try to connect the with the researchers more by offering a lot of the workshops, and we also started the open science program just to do more outreach and all sorts of events, and to basically advocate for all these best practices. But we feel like there's limited things we can do at the moment.
I see. Are you getting a lot of uptake on some of your programming, the workshops and things like that?
It's very variable. What I recently started to do, usually for things like software carpentries, or anything that's teaching programming, data science, that's very popular. But if we want to teach reproducibility, data management, it's not great. So what I recently started to do is to have a Jupyter notebooks for plotting, and then I start the workshop with some reproducibility best practices, and then demonstrate with the hands-on session, which I found people liked it.
That's great. It sounds like you all have a nicely formed program already. I'm curious from the researchers, for any of the researchers in the room, I'd like to know, what are the things that you most want from the data support professionals? I know one thing that researcher has said to us is that they need some exemplars. So when we ask for a reproducible data package, they want to know exactly what that is and what it looks like. That's one thing that we're working on right now. I don't know if anyone has others that researchers have requested for them, or if researchers have some thoughts on this.
Hi, this is Nancy Kassebaum. I'm a researcher, a psychologist at University of Pennsylvania and Children's Hospital Philadelphia. I think exemplars are a really good idea. I think in my own work as a researcher, I'm striving to be as reproducible as possible and to keep track of processes, et cetera. I also lead an effort among folks in my sort of subfield studying traumatic stress to gather data together and data sets together and to make reusable data. And we've tried to embrace FAIR within the traumatic stress field. And so I think that there's such a wide range of skills and knowledge and willingness, both to go back to historical data or past research data and make it more fair, as well as to implement these practices so that going forward they will be more fair. And I think one of the things we're trying to do is to create toolkits sort of customized for our field, which is very multidisciplinary. So it's health and social sciences and policy and public health all together, but customized for our content area so that people can see themselves. Maybe it's another example of providing exemplars. They can find specific tools that work with the kinds of data sets that we tend to produce.
That's great. There's a lot of things happening in psychology. And so it's been great. Thank you for that. All right, so if you are still, if you still have the poll link, Flora, if you could put it in the chat again. There's one other question, poll style question.
Maybe while you're looking at that, real quick, just another thing that researchers often tell us that they want is not to have additional work to do. Yes. So anyhow, that brings to me questions about sort of early training and doing things, you know, just like Nancy basically brought up, like doing things correctly in the first place, so that by the time it gets to the point where they want to deposit, that it's not that difficult. But sorry for jumping in there.
And that's a good point. That is helpful.
I would definitely second that. And I think akin to that is where there is necessarily extra work, to have that built into funders' expectations, for example, for grant funding, that data curation, all the work involved in doing it right from in the first place will be built right in, or will be an allowable cost. And not just allowable, maybe even having increased funding levels, because if it's an allowable cost, but it means it's a zero sum and you have to take it away from something else, that becomes a challenge.
Yes, and it seems like there are indications that the funding agencies are supporting this idea of having a budget item for data management and data curation. But it's hard to tell whether or not that's really happening, or they're just saying it, or I'm not quite sure yet, but it looks that way. In the National Academy's report, they do have recommendations specifically to funders to support data management and curation. So I'm glad to see that happening. So yes, this question, what is or are the most important issues that must be addressed in order to achieve the Cure Fair Working Group goal? I was worried people would just click on all of them, but we see some things. The training and education, that comes up a lot. Standardization for metadata.
And you can choose more than one, yeah. As people are looking at this and thinking through.
And this is very helpful for us as we, the next thing we'll be doing, we have one other question, but another thing that we'll be doing is looking at our case statement. We want to make sure that we prioritize the issues that are most important to the community, or ones that we believe are most critical and moving things along with computational reproducibility and curation.
I'm wondering if people who chose metadata standardization can say a little bit more about what they mean, or what are the challenges that they are facing right now along those lines.
I was going to ask the same thing, and not to put anybody on the spot in particular, but Nancy, you mentioned that you're doing a lot of work that's very transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary. What sort of, maybe could you speak to some of the challenges you faced in attempting to accommodate multiple, we've already heard about how one terminology might be used in a particular domain and then versus another space, maybe speaking to what sort of challenges you faced in a very, very crucial and important field, but one that does cross multiple different domains.
Yeah, well, everything you just said. And I think that we're not even used to thinking about, I'm not sure that most of my fellow researchers, the ones who could control the process of, say, applying metadata to their data, or even know what the metadata standards are, for the particular domain-specific repository or collection of data sets that I'm engaged in this international collaboration. We're using DDI as a metadata standard, but even that has been a huge steep learning curve. It's the best fit, I think, as a social science, largely social science studies, but I don't find that most folks even know what the metadata standards are. And I think for this intersection between social science and healthcare, I mean, my home institution is a medical school at the University of Pennsylvania and the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and mostly with other biomedical scientists, and we sometimes think about things in quite different ways. So I think those certainly are challenges, and having, even to know what the landscape is and the possibility of metadata standards, then to find the gaps in those. We don't have ontologies or controlled vocabularies once we get down into the nitty-gritty of some of the variables that we tend to assess or include in our studies. And then knowing how to, like, having some level of crosswalk between those to know how to put them together. All of that is a challenge, and it was not included, I think, for most, I can speak for most of my fellow researchers, I was gonna say of my age, maybe of any age, that it was not really built into our training in the content areas in which we were trained to be researchers.
I can follow up on that. That's great information from another domain. Also similar in the social sciences, but folks who are working with experiments and are trying to take schema from clinical trials and apply it to experiments that are done in social science and economics, and are running into issues where even something as simple as a metadata or a field about what's the population under study here, who are the subjects, you know, in clinical trials, it's individuals, and in economics, in the kinds of experiments they're doing, a lot of the time it could be a village or you know, any other entity. So there's sort of issues in terms of interpretation of the results and other things that you could get kind of crossed wires when you're just kind of invoking a metadata field and just looking at that. You think you understand, you think you know, but it has different implications because your units are different and that kind of thing.
And Brian, you're making a good point in the chat about the tension between simplicity and the desire for robust semantic representation. We know DDI, if you use the full DDI schema, there are hundreds of metadata elements in it. I think DDI Lite has, what, 300? You know, as data professionals, you want all the metadata, but at the same time, we know that can be unrealistic. And so thinking about what is the minimal metadata to achieve our aims, but also making it usable for researchers.
I could just say one other thing, that the primary goal of the project that I'm leading is it certainly includes reproducibility, but really the primary goal is reusability, and for new integrative data analyses that would not otherwise be possible. And so one of the main reasons for metadata at the somewhat at the study level, but also at the variable level, is to just enable harmonization in a number of different ways, not to prescribe a way of harmonizing, but to make it even possible. Yeah, that's all.
That's a great point. Okay. I'm going to give control, screen control back to Anthony. We have one more question. Not a poll question.
Yeah, give me one moment to pull slides back up.
But thank you for responding to the poll. It didn't break, so I'm relieved. The last question, we're wondering if there are models that already exist for data curation practices that support reproducibility and FAIR. If any of you have any experiences with some tools, and some people mentioned some software, like we're hearing more about notebooks, lab notebooks, Jupyter notebooks. Wondering if there are any other organizations, initiatives, tools that you know of that we should explore for data curation for reproducibility and FAIR. Of course, if there were tons of them, we wouldn't be here, right?
I mean, I think one that comes up that people will mention in addition to notebooks is containers. And, you know, that I don't want to launch a whole conversation about that and the pros and cons of that for reproducibility, but, you know, just sort of throwing out terms or tools and other things that people are talking about right now. I would say that's one of them.
So this is Brian again. Sorry. I'm kind of starting to emphasize, you know, maybe Jupyter notebooks or other things that people can use on the long tail research. So not big data, but just stuff where something like that would facilitate being able to provide the scripts, the codes that they use. But what I'm not really sure about is what the current quote unquote best practices are, you know, in terms of a system that we could use that's not gonna just pop up and then disappear in 6 months because something else came along and became more popular. So I'm wondering if that's something that you guys have dug into or providing resources on, you know, what kind of method, because it used to be people talked about Docker and then Binder and things like that. And I don't know what's in vogue or what kinds of approaches I should be encouraging people to follow. Thanks.
No, that's a very good point, and I think kind of begs the question of ease of use factor of what are people implementing within their own pedagogy, or what are particular labs, what's kind of in vogue within particular domains or within particular sites. So those are certainly one of the goals of the working group, is to see what might be something that has a bit more staying power, or has a bit more a bit more staying power across different domains. Maybe that could be a question that I would have for you all as well, is in your own practices or providing support to other researchers, what have you found that's relatively easy for them to implement? What kind of gets them over that hump of adoption to start for an ease of use? What kind of gets them moving in the way of reproducibility, and then might get them to using something a bit more complex, but that's sort of what opens the first door and gets them moving.
I think a lot of the deposits I see, I do some curation for a general purpose repository. And a lot of the deposits I see are usually, if they're bothering to include code or something to try and make the results reproducible, tend to see a lot of Python or things coming from R. Sometimes MATLAB, but I don't know if that's what you mean here for models that support reproducible practices. But those are sort of the.
Yeah, I think it is good to know what are those common software programs that people are using and the packages within them. So if it's the case that you're seeing a lot of people adopting R or Python or what have you, and then I think part of our work in this working group is to determine then, given those tools, how can we make those their practices reproducible so that the products that come out of the research are reproducible. So I think it is important to know those, and that's really helpful. Thank you.
So I don't know if this is like really related to this conversation, but I've been recently involved in this data curation network. I'm not sure if, yeah, so what we did is to generate some disciplinary specific primers that help to like the repository to look at the metadata and characteristics of the data sets, what makes it more reproducible, right? And I think one of the primers is like Drupal notebooks. So like looking into those might be helpful.
Thank you for that. Yes, I recently used the geospatial database primer. So thank you, DCN. They are pretty great. So
yeah.
I should add to the notes for other people.
Definitely
too.
shout out, great resource. Yeah, I mean, I think on the point of using Python or R or languages like that, especially for analysis, one question that we as a group might want to work on is that a recommendation that we want to make, that people move to using these sort of tools and this kind of software and away from, say, my field, people are using Stata. And what are the pros and cons of that? So one might be better for reproducibility, so scripting as opposed to point and clicking, more transparency versus something more opaque. But then there's sort of back and forth issues about license and accessibility, availability of the software and those kind of things. But those are really good questions. And I take the, Brian's question earlier about, how do we know, what can we recommend for people to do that will have staying power and that we know we're recommending the right thing for people to do. So thanks for that.
Yep. Part of it for me is I've got some people that are, I'm getting some uptake, which is really cool. So I want to make sure that I'm giving them good advice and not something that's going to kind of burn the bridges when later it kind of disappears into the ether and they invest a lot of time into it and then it goes away, if you know what I mean. So. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's already hard enough to get researchers to come on board, right? To try something new, to change their workflows or their practice. So we want to give them good advice. Definitely.
One of the staying power for us is actually, with regards to R, is R Markdown and the library checkpoint. You should check that out. Checkpoint. It's a way of basically what it does is that it looks for all the packages that the researchers used on the day that they actually run the analysis. And if you package that, if you have checkpoint in your code, it will actually use those packages on the day that they run that code. So, which is really a very interesting package. And that has staying power for us. A lot of our researchers that use our results reproduction service at Cornell actually use that package because we recommend it.
So I would just to piggyback off that, we've talked a lot about some of the software and packages that could be used for that computational reproducibility. In your own spaces, are you aware one thing that we've faced a lot within the Health Data Services Working Group is building a metadata schema that is both granular enough and interoperable enough with a number of different health-specific protocol and processes metadata standards. So FHIR and areas of the Encore network are attempting to build kind of a descriptive metadata that describes those processes for data curation or data analyses or munging data, etc. But those seem to be, which is a point that Limor brought up, of this might be very applicable to this one particular domain, but doesn't necessarily map onto other domain practices. Within your own spaces, have you seen ways of describing those workflows or describing those processes or metadata standards and descriptors that have been helpful for trying to encapsulate the entirety of that entire research workflow? Obviously, it's a big question. So,
yeah, but that's definitely a question we might want to follow up and elicit more feedback as we go forward. I feel like to have like one overarching tool that captures everything from the beginning of the research onward is a great idea in theory. I think that it depends on the field, because in some field the work is pretty standardized, so it's easy for people to do. They use the same tools and they all share resources and that kind of thing. But in the social sciences, I mean, literally every faculty member or graduate student can make up their own thing, and it would be really difficult. When it comes, so in our case, when it comes to the point of wanting, you know, where you can catch them is when they want to, as someone mentioned earlier, when they want to deposit or share the data or in the code, or they have to. And then we have a tool that can capture what we do with all of those files, all that information as it goes through the workflow, the curation workflow. But and maybe, pipe dream at some point we can connect the curation workflow with kind of the research workflow and have the two talk to each other, and that would be beautiful. But that's sort of my sense of that.
no. Oh, thank you so much, Limor. Yeah. I agree that it's a hard thing to face across different domains or within particular domains. And apologies if I'm cutting in and out, so do let me know.
So we have another 15 minutes. We're going to 6:30.
Correct. 30
Eastern. So yes. Another thing that we'd like to do is to get some feedback on the draft case statement. And so the link is on the slides and also in the chat, so you could just click on it.
Yeah.
And so all of this conversation that we've had so far, your feedback, your perspectives have been really valuable, and they will inform this case statement and our work moving forward. But we would love it for you all to be able to take a look at what we have so far and, pop in some comments about what you'd like to see in there, particularly the deliverables that we're thinking about for this working group, the timeline, the work plan. Also I think, is it in, the case statements, let me take a look. We'd like to get a sense of, actually, no, in the case statement, there's also a list of membership. So if you are interested in joining this working group and helping us out with the case statement, some of the activities, if you could put your name there, that would be great.
Should we add our name to the document or go to the RDA website and press the join group button or whatever they have, however it's set up?
I think you could do both.
Okay.
If you want to just go to the RDA and add your name there and be officially, do it through RDA, then we will add your name here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that way you'll also receive emails and be on the group communication stream as well.
Yeah.
And in the session notes too, if you haven't already, please add your name to the participant list in the session notes. And in there to indicate how you might want to participate. If you'd like to help us with this draft or any of our other reports that we're putting out, if you'd like to maybe lead a smaller task group within the working group, or if you're thinking that maybe you'd like to test some of our products or be an adopter, we'd love to know that as well.
Yes, that would be very helpful. In terms of the process through RDA, we're hoping to get your feedback on this case statement and then submit that to the folks, the committee who's going to approve that. If it gets approved, we're thinking of an 18-month horizon where our ultimate sort of deliverable will be a document that will outline the standards and the guidelines for curating for reproducible and fair data in code. And so we hope to be able to have, worked through a lot of the questions that you've raised here, and to have, a sense that we can share with everyone and kind of recommend for, if you're going to work with researchers, here's what, what we would want to share with them and what we would want to tell them to do in support of this. Or if you are a repository manager, here are the curation practices that you might want to consider. And then we can think through how to implement them and what tools we might want to use or create if they don't exist. So there's, in the document, there's like a kind of a breakdown of, how we would spend the 18 months in terms of time and what we would produce at different intervals. So we'd love to get your comments on that. Does that make sense? Does it seem like enough time? And as Tumai mentioned, please let us know your level of interest in engaging with this, even if it's just a piece of that. So as you look through, for example, we have this idea of creating a matrix that shows curation practices that are specifically for reproducibility and those that are specifically supporting FAIR, and what's the overlap between them and what differs. So that if you're interested in a project like that, we would love to know.
And as well, with all working groups, there's kind of test adopters throughout. So if you'd be interested in participating just as not so much creating the deliverable, but testing the implementation and use of the final deliverable or providing feedback, that's also an option. So yeah, any engagement you're willing to provide is always very, very welcome.
I'm curious if maybe sorry, did you want to say something?
No, I was saying I'm happy to continue sharing my screen so we can look at this as a group or whatever everybody prefers. But sorry to interrupt. Go ahead, Lumar.
Yeah, no, please do. I think that's great. I'm just wondering if anyone has experience from their own experience at RDA with work groups of sort of a process to do this that they recommend. So we mentioned maybe like a small task force or task group to work on specific things. But if there are other ideas that people might have that they want to share right now on, you know, we were part of another RDA group, and we, by the way, have a nice list of groups here that we think there's nice overlap. But if you were involved with any of these or any other ones, and you saw a model that was successful, you know, what was that like?
Sorry, if you're looking for process for organizing the group, the Data Discovery Paradigms Interest Group, they actually, I think they meet on a regular basis. They talk about topics that people might want to address, and then they set up task forces that produce a small output. So that's worked very well for them, but that's a fairly large group, I think, and fairly, they've got fairly diverse people in it.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that would be great. Yeah, all the different perspectives would be really helpful. I feel like a lot of times, you know, I'm just so stuck in what's in front of me. I'd like to learn more about some perspectives from folks working in different domains, or from the software programming end or the infrastructure end. Those things, I'd love to get some feedback from those folks.
Sorry, I may have missed that. Do you have a time frame for when you envisage submitting the case statement?
I think we were in our case statement, we may have said that we're hoping by the next plenary to be recognized.
Okay, thanks.
So I guess we would have to work backwards from that.
Yes, so it would be good to submit something, if you want to be on the safe side, probably at least 3 months before the plenary. So that would be August, I think. But if you do it earlier, that's good too. I mean, you've got quite a bit of momentum here. You might want to use that.
Yeah.
I don't know about you all, but times feels so abstract lately.
Oh yeah, very
Yeah.
fluid.
So would you like to, would you like us to take a look at this over the next little while? And then do you want to, I mean, because honestly, I'll struggle just reading this right now and providing feedback, but
Sure.
would it be possible for us to just read this over the next little while and then get back to you by roughly when, or add comments roughly when?
Yeah, I think absolutely. We don't expect everyone to read right now and have comments. If you do, that's great. But we maybe would want to say, I don't know, what would be a reasonable time frame for this? I don't know if like a few weeks, a couple weeks. I mean, yeah, something like that, so that people don't forget, and we can follow up with everyone who was on this call. You know, so we'll have some sort of mailing with our slides as well, and other information, and then we can sort of remind everyone that if they have feedback, they can send it back to us.
Do we want to say maybe? Yeah, the 24th for kind of group comments, and then we can produce the final clean submission by the end of April for the 30th. or does that seem like too short of a period, too long of a period? Just throwing up some potential dates. That is the kind of like couple of weeks.
I think the 24th or somewhere around then makes sense because you've got Easter as well. So yeah, so that might be a good time. And then maybe if you give yourselves 2 weeks to organize the final version.
That sounds good to me. Yeah. That's great. That sounds like a plan to me.
Yep, sounds good.
And just as a reminder, I've put into chat how you can become a member to RDA if you're not yet. And I think the link to the actual group is in the case statement, and it's also in the collaborative session notes. So if you want to become members, you just go to the group page and join once you're an RDA member.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you very much for doing that. I've been an RDA member for a few years now, and so if there's anyone sort of new who's listening in, I felt a little overwhelmed in the beginning, and it was like, whoa, there's so much to do, and I'm not sure I'm ready for it. And so it's been a process. You have to kind of find what you're passionate about and like really dive in. But it's okay also to be a member who is supporting, by going to the sessions and reading and maybe providing feedback when you can. And so don't, feel like you have to really jump in, all at once. But of course, everyone who wants to is welcome.
And we're thinking of maybe running next week a sort of kind of Ask Me Anything session about RDA, because I think we have quite a few new people there. So just make it a combined sort of meet RDA people and ask questions thing. But I'll have to set that up. I haven't been able to do that yet.
Nice, very cool.
Yeah, fantastic. Great. So we're coming up to the end of our time. Is there anything else that we are forgetting that we should go over? If anybody wants to do this again with us tomorrow,
Yes.
We'll be doing this again in a few hours. But thanks, everyone. And we really look forward to keeping in touch and having everyone join us and work with us on this.
Yes, and I hope we'll be able to see each other in person. Please, everybody, stay safe and take care of yourself.
Yes,
Yes, please. Yes. Okay.
All right. And with that, we'll leave the documents open, right? I mean, the documents are open. So if anybody wants to linger and look through anything right now, feel free. But otherwise, we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks to you.